Welcome. Today I'm explore the Tennison Gambit, which is known as a trap arising from the Scandinavian defense. After the first move pawn to e4, black responds with pawn to d5, and white enters the gambit by playing knight to f3, gambling on the pawn at e4. But in that case, you depend on your opponent choosing the Scandinavian defense. There's actually a way to make this trap much more universal. Let's take it back. You can enter the very same position, starting from the reti opening. You play knight to f3 first, and since your opponent will usually reply with either pawn to d5 or pawn to e5, you've already taken away the e5 square. Therefore, your opponent is left with only pawn to d5, which is also the most common move here. Then you play pawn to e4, transposing and tricking your opponent into the same Tennison Gambit. Just in case you don't know, the main line goes as follows. Black captures with pawn takes a 4, accepting the gambit. Then white plays knight to g5, starting a more or less forced line that can lead to you crushing your opponent in just about 8 moves or even less. Now, white is attacking the pawn, and black normally defends it with their knight from g8 to f6. Then white plays pawn to d3, attacking the pawn once again. Black usually feels comfortable trading it off since they are already a pawn up. After pawn takes d3, white recaptures with bishop takes d3. Here's the moment of truth. Black is still a pawn ahead, but they're a little annoyed by your knight on g5, which is attacking their position, and your bishop is also putting pressure. Many players here will play pawn to h6, which walks directly into the trap. Now comes the strike. White plays knight takes f7. If black captures back with king takes f7, white delivers the deadly bishop to g6 check. This is a discovered attack. You check the king and win the queen on the next move. This way, you expose your opponent's king, win their queen, and secure a totally winning position. It's simple, powerful, and extremely effective. I'm going to share with you some additional ideas on how you can use the same opening variation, not only against the Scandinavian defense, but also against the Caro-Kann defense and even certain lines of the Sicilian defense. I'll also show you some pitfalls you need to be aware of, because there is one variation that stronger opponents may try against you. After black accepts the gambit pawn and you play knight to g5, instead of defending the pawn on e4 with knight to f6, some opponents may choose queen to d5. This move defends their pawn on e4 while simultaneously attacking your knight on g5. At first glance, it looks like you are in serious trouble, but if you know the correct response, the solution is truly beautiful. You play pawn to d3. With this move, you attack black's pawn on e4 while also defending your knight on g5. Usually black is happy to trade pawns here. After the exchange, you recapture with bishop takes d3. Now it may appear that you have made a mistake because black can play queen takes g2, seemingly winning a free pawn and threatening your rook in the corner. However, this is exactly the trap. Instead of panicking, you calmly play bishop to e4. With this move, your bishop is x-raying the rook on h8. You defend it indirectly while also attacking black's queen. At this point, the queen has very few safe squares. The only reasonable move is queen to g4. But after that, you simply trade queens, and then play bishop takes b7, winning the rook on the next move. Black has no defense. This way, what looked dangerous for you actually flips around into a completely winning position for white. If your opponent isn't tempted by the bait and doesn't fall for the trap, they will often play pawn to h6 to chase away your knight. But here comes another beautiful line. Instead of retreating, you play knight to c3, counterattacking their queen. Now black attacks your knight, thinking they are putting pressure on you. At this point, black often believes they can retreat their queen, give a check, and then capture your knight afterwards. So you calmly move your knight back to a4. The nice thing here is that while you are developing your pieces, black remains completely undeveloped. This already gives you a huge advantage. Of course, black still has ideas. They may try pawn to f5, hoping that since your knight is pinned to the king, they can capture it on the next move and win material. Here's where the fun begins. One really nasty move is bishop to e2. On the surface, it looks like you are backing down and worried about black's attack. But in reality, you are setting a deadly trap. If black continues with pawn takes e4, then you strike with queen to h5 checkmate. Notice that your queen completely cuts off black's king from escaping, and this is a full checkmate on the spot. This shows how dangerous the position can be for black, even if they avoid the earlier traps. And the beauty of this Tennison Gambit setup is that you can trick your opponent into the same patterns through other openings as well. For example, in the Caro-Kann defense, after you start with pawn to e4 and black responds with pawn to c6, you play knight to f3, pretending to enter the two knights variation. Then after pawn to d5, black once again falls into the same Tennison Gambit ideas. You begin with pawn to d3, pretending that you simply wanted to defend your position, but after black captures with pawn takes a4, you suddenly jump in with knight to g5. Now, your opponent wants to protect their extra pawn, so they capture again. At this point, you recapture with bishop takes d3. Against the Caro-Kann defense, this works even better than in other openings. Look at the position. You are directly threatening to capture black's central pawn, with both your knight and bishop coordinating against it. Not only that, but you also create the possibility of capturing black's bishop afterwards. The two most common ways for black to defend this pawn are to push it forward or to defend it with knight to f6. But here's the beauty. Both defenses lose to the exact same tactic. Whether black plays pawn to h6 or knight to f6, you unleash the devastating blow knight takes f7. This forks the queen and the rook, forcing black to recapture with the king. But then comes bishop to g6 check, opening up a deadly discovered attack. You check the king and immediately win the queen, securing a completely winning game. And here's another cool bonus. You can use this same tactical pattern against one of the most popular openings of all, the Sicilian defense. After you play pawn to a4 and black responds with pawn to c5, entering the Sicilian defense, you go for pawn to c3, known as the Alapin variation. One of the major replies here is pawn to d5, which transposes directly into the Tennison Gambit ideas we've already seen. Of course, black may choose something else. For example, at the amateur level, one of the most common moves is knight to c6. Let's focus on one of black's main moves, pawn to d5. Most players will capture here, but instead we're going to steer the game into the Tennison Gambit direction by playing knight to f3. You can already see the familiar pattern. We're offering the pawn on e4 for free. Black captures it, and then you play knight to g5, following the same setup as before. Black usually defends the pawn with knight to f6, and then you play pawn to d3. After pawn takes d3 and bishop takes d3, we reach the critical moment. At this point, many opponents feel annoyed by the pressure you've created. Very often, they will play pawn to h6, trying to chase away your knight. Of course, some opponents might play something else. Let's focus on the most common response, pawn to h6. Here you know exactly what to do. Knight takes 7. This completely destroys black's position and puts them in big trouble. After king takes f7, you have a beautiful choice of how to continue. You can win with bishop to g6, or sometimes even with bishop to c4. For example, bishop to g6 once again opens up a deadly discovered attack. You check the king and immediately win the queen, leaving black defenseless. Now, some of you pointed out in the comments that these tactics may not work as reliably against players rated above 2,000. But let's be honest. Most players are nowhere near that level, and most of your opponents will never reach it. That's why this trap is so effective. Let me show you a common example of why. In this line, white's position is already totally winning. After king takes f7, you win the queen on d8. You've exposed black's king, won massive material, and are in a completely dominant position. But here's the catch. Many players, after winning the queen, make a losing mistake. In this position, after black plays knight to c6, lots of white players carelessly play queen to c7, which looks natural but actually loses the game instantly. Why? Because black responds with pawn to a5, and suddenly your queen is trapped. It has no way out, and on the very next move, black will capture it with knight to d5 or knight to e8. Just like that, black turns the tables and is winning. Thanks for watching.